Alex Mady, JoBlo.com. Nice to meet you. How you doing?
Good. Doing good.
So I need to start out with an apology for all three of you. And I've stated this in my reviews for the series that I didn't watch it for the first 4 seasons when it first premiered. There's so much TV to watch and reviewing everything. It was just on the list and didn't make it on there. And then I finally caught up. Like, how could I miss this show for so long, only to find out that now it's coming to an end. So it's a shortened season. It's a phenomenal season. I love the entire journey, and I'm really glad you got to tell the entire arc. But was this always the plan to end it here versus taking it somewhere different than where the novels go?
This was a plan. There were a number of places where it could have ended, and we talked about it over the years, the three of us. The end of book 6, there was a natural ending for the show. And so when we got to this point and, Amazon was saying this was going to be the final season, it was a natural place to do it. I'm glad we got to hit this book.
The idea was always to stay pretty close to the source material, though. Yeah. Naren was, when Naren was brought on, he was explicitly given permission to deviate wildly from the books and chose not to. So that's kudos to him for that.
That was a great Hollywood moment, actually, because it was don't feel compelled to stick to the story. And my response was, but I like the story. I and many other people seem to like the story as well. So why change that? But that's how things get.
And Naren, you have a history in genre television. You've been involved with some obviously huge shows. Was there ever an intention to make this like those, or did you want this to be Star Trek, or did you want this to be its own thing?
I definitely didn't want it to be Star Trek. I had actually stayed away from genre for a long time. I started in genre, and then I did cop shows and mystery shows for a long time with CSI. And I had not actually found genre particularly interesting. And when I read the pilot script and then the books, it was a very different kind of a science fiction show, and space was a character, and the reality of life in space was a character. And it was a very different way of looking at things. And I was actually, it was kind of like, oh, wow, they're really serious about making this kind of show. Well, that was something I was interested in being part of.
And for Ty and Daniel, based on where this story starts back in season 1, it has there's like a noir element to it. There's that mystery component to it, and it has evolved over time. Was your idea for this story ever rooted in it being a genre story, or does it just happen to be a story that you set in outer space?
No, I mean, I think it's pretty clearly designed from the ground up to be a science fiction story. We do like to play with other genres as you said, kind of noir in the first one. We do a bit of a political thriller in the second book. The third book is our haunted house story. But yeah, I mean, I don't think this story can take place anywhere other than in the future in space. So I think it's pretty connected to its genre roots.
That said, science fiction is really awesome in that it has room for all the other genres to fit inside of it. Yeah. So that made it, something we can play with.
I also think the construction of the first book, by building it around a detective story and the missing girl story, it was accessibility. It really was something that, an audience could understand the concept of it, and the world could sort of exist around it. So you got introduced to it that way. And I think that was it was a gentler path into something that could have been, very difficult or being perceived as a very high barrier for entry.
And having the show move to Prime, when you had that switch, was there concern at that point that, oh no, we're not going to get to be able to tell this story? And did that change the way that you approached the final seasons?
No, I think Amazon, more than anything, gave us the freedom to do the story we wanted to do. There was never any sense that there was a new constraint or a new requirement that we tell a different story. The studio that we work with and working with Amazon, both of them were very sort of creatively gave us permission to do what we wanted to do.
Although I do have to say, it's funny to hear you describe it as like when we moved to Prime, because I would describe it as more like we were asked to leave sci-fi.
And there tends to be, and I mentioned this in my review, there tends to be a stigma for a lot of people with sci-fi, the channel, that there's a certain level of quality with the programming, that for every Battlestar Galactica, you have a Sharknado. So you don't always have the consistency across the board. And it's the Expanse is its own show, but that quality, it reminds me a lot of Battlestar Galactica in just the production values, the quality of it. The acting is phenomenal. You've got this ensemble cast. Did you ever feel indebted in any way to that series or any other series in the approach that you had in creating the look or style of the show?
I'm a huge fan of Galactica, and I think it was an absolute milestone, especially on the Sci-Fi Channel. I think, they were great. Actually, they were great partners at the beginning with us launching the show, because they wanted to change the nature of the programming on their network. They didn't want to be the Sharknado network, and we were part of a kind of a new regime there, and it was a flagship show for them. I don't think Galactica inspired our look any. I think the look of the Expanse was quite distinct. And that's all Ty and Daniel. I mean, those environments were in the books. We tried to realize them, as faithfully as possible in the show. And the ships don't fly like they do in Galactica. The worlds don't work the same way, because we respect physics and we use it for drama. And that's, I think, say is the way to describe it.
And there's scenes, I don't want to give anything away, obviously. There's scenes at the beginning of each of these episodes this season that are clearly setting things up. Is there a plan for a life beyond this season, for this universe, for this story on screen?
Plan is such a strong word. It's a big world. There are lots of possibilities in it.
There's 3 more books.
There's 3 more books.
There's 3 more books.
Things could happen.
And I would say that the way that this season goes, there's always like a feeling of stakes, that they're like the stakes are raised and that it's barreling towards this conclusion, and you've got the momentum and the action. And I know from last season, not everybody is ever safe when you're watching the show, that some characters that you love may or may not make it. Was there anything that you felt that you needed to change in adapting the novel for this season that changed, or do you feel like you kept it as consistent as you wanted with the book?
I mean, well, anytime you take 160 or 70,000 word novel and try to turn it into between 5 and 10 hours of TV, there's compression. It's just part of it. So the conversation is always, which things do we absolutely have to have to get the spirit of what this novel is saying on screen, and which are things that we can lose without losing that, the important theme of the book. And so, yeah, I mean, that's every season we've had to do that. So it's not like this season is unique in that way. But yeah, we had a lot of conversations about which things we could cut and still keep what we were trying to do in the bigger picture.
We also had, I think, a fair chunk of book 6 plot lines that had actually naturally moved into season 5. Yeah. So in that sense, it gave us a little bit more flexibility. The compression wasn't as drastic as it might have been.
So the planning of something like this, like you just mentioned, you have these big books, there's lots of characters and subplots and all of that. How do you structure that when you're creating the season? You mentioned that it naturally, some elements moved into season 5. Do you then have to say, well, we're going to have to compensate and change the story here? Or do you plot the whole thing out in advance and then separate it into episodes?
It's sort of simultaneous, I would say. Yeah. It's like we talk about it very holistically. And once we know like the number of episodes we're working within, we start putting structure to it. I think the biggest choice in season 6 was the starting point. It's because it's 6 episodes. We did want to have that constant escalation episode to episode to build over the season. And so that to me meant starting our heroes at the lowest point possible and then just kind of crawling up the ladder, right? It's like and I think that's tonally, that's what we did with the show. So because we felt like, you know, the book has a few more, I would say, ups and downs, right, on the way to the end, and that would have been more difficult to accommodate in a 6-episode structure.
And these characters they're so layered, and there's so many different factions and ways that they could go. Do you view these characters in your own hearts, when you're thinking about it, do you view them as heroes and villains, or do you view them as more ambivalent, that they could be a little bit of both?
I mean, you cannot write a character as a villain. You can write that they do villainous things, but if you're in their point of view and they don't have a good reason for themselves why they're doing the things that they're doing, then they're a bad character. So I think, certainly in seasons 5 and 6, Marco comes to the fore, sort of the main antagonist of the series. But Marco thinks he's right, and he's able to attract people to his cause because they think he's right. So you have to be sympathetic to that. You have to be sympathetic to his starting point and why he's doing the things that he's doing, and why people find his actions attractive and want to follow him. If he's just twirling his mustache and saying, haha, I'll be evil, it's just a bad character at that point.
Philosophically, I mean, very early on, we had these discussions. We were asked, the network would say, who's the big bad? And our response is, we don't have big bads. It's like, the big bad is what? Human nature, maybe. Tribalism is a big bad. It's like, but we never saw them in terms of heroes and villains. It simplifies, I think, the ideas too much when you go that route.
Yeah, I mean, the deadliest thing in our show is just space.
Yeah,
we're more
absolutely.
likely to be killed by space than a bad guy.
Yeah.
And I think that watching the show, it's very natural anytime I watch something to think, oh, this reminds me of something else. This reminds me of that. I found myself in a unique position watching this season, seeing Marco and not thinking that he reminds me of somebody else, but thinking, I wish that this is how they had written Khan in Star Trek, because if this had been Khan probably would have won, just because he's charismatic, and you can see all of those moments. And there's scenes, well, I'm not giving anything away, but there's scenes in the beginning of the 2nd episode all the way through the last one where you just see, he's willing to let pawns go on the chessboard, and it's frightening, but at the same time, he doesn't necessarily seem wrong in what he's saying. So it's everybody is so layered and so well done that I get what you're saying, that you can't just write him as a villain, but he's a pretty good villain. So one last question for you is, I think that there's going to be people that are going to come into watching this, and they are going to have those Game of Thrones hesitancies that series barreled towards a conclusion and it didn't live up to what everybody thought it was going to be. Do you have any concerns that people are going to think, people who didn't read the books, let's say, that this is not a place that the story should end? Do you have any concerns about that?
I kind of don't. Ty points out there's a text scroll at the beginning of the first episode of the first season, and if you go and look at that text scroll again when you get to the end of season 6, we answered the questions. We told the story we were here to tell, and I think people will find that.
And I definitely did find it a satisfying conclusion. I'm very happy with it. I enjoyed it. And thank you all so much for your time. And I'm looking forward to everybody getting to see it.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it, man.
Thanks.